Hi, Joetta. Frank Korb here. Thanks for reaching out to me. I think the best way that I can respond to your questions is a quick video. And you get to see the inside of my studio. Well, at least the back wall of the studio. So the first question, and I appreciate these questions. I think they're really good, very strong, probing questions. I hope I can answer them succinctly. The first question you've got is, what are you currently working on? For the past probably 4 years, 5 years or so, I've really been focusing in on what's happening in society. Not all of my work necessarily screams social commentary, but I've been doing a lot more about it. Things like climate change, voting rights, which is what the past 4 major works I've been working on have been about. Climate change, voting rights, other things that are out there in the news that are important. However, the basis behind all of the work that I do is through abstraction. I'm really talking about relationships, whether it's the colors that are in the abstract work or whether it's the shapes and the forms that build up the object. So I think about the red line, the red shape behind me, and that black line that's chasing through it. It's not only the black line as it relates to itself, but it's also the relationship with that black line and the red, white, and blue canvas underneath it, and how it deals with the edges of the picture plane. And then the quilt on the left side, that side, it's actually going to be separated from what's on this side. So there's that lack of relationship or the not connecting. And so those are the kinds of things that I deal with in my art. It's relationships, it's elements and principles, it's the building blocks. I guess everything in life's all about relationships. My preferred medium is really acrylic paint, collage. I use a lot of additive materials, things that add texture to the material, sand, Rolotex, stones, pebbles, grit, things like that. In the paint itself, in the acrylics themselves, I also use a lot of gel medium. I use a lot of modeling paste to build up the texture. The gel medium makes it more transparent. Sometimes it gives it more of a shine. So I can build up layers and layers. And then almost everything that I do is built on top of collage. So whether if we look at the red board, it has collage underneath the red paint. If we look at the canvas underneath it, I collage the Constitution on that. And then inside the quilt, I've got collaged book pages inside. So there's a lot of materials that I use. So I guess the major material, the main medium that I use is acrylic paint. My favorite art tool, what's my favorite art tool? Well, it's probably the paint brushes that I use. I use a lot of other materials to add the paint to the ground, big paint scrapers like one might scrape a house with. I like using the space that I have. I think that's probably one of the most valuable things I've got. I'm fortunate to have a nice size workspace that's in my home, so it's convenient. So it's the time also, and I think finding the time in my day. So there's a lot of art tools out there, but paintbrushes, space, and time. Do you have a piece you're especially proud of? Well, absolutely. The piece behind me, the piece that happened just before it, and you can find that on art. You can find that one on frankkorb.com. It's the header at the point of this conversation on November 9th, 2021. But it's also in the Abstractions 2021. You can check that out. Of course, I have pieces that I am especially proud of, but more importantly, I think it's the process of making a piece and moving on to the next piece and learning from that piece and moving on to the next piece and paying attention to what's happening in society and making artwork that's about that. And then sometimes making artwork that's just about itself. Those, like I said earlier, those relationships within. But sure, of course, we all have artwork that we're especially proud of. Your next question is, how do you know when a work is finished? Well, I'm a by training, I'm a graphic designer. I haven't done a lot of graphic designing in a long time, but I think that through being trained as a graphic artist, the whole planning stage was a big part of what I put into as a designer, put into that, but then as a fine artist, I put into the work that I build and create. So even the randomness that might appear in some of the works, it's probably thought of first in a sketchbook, or at least it's considered in my sketchbook. I think I'm hard pressed to not have a plan before I start something. Even smaller works, I'm probably thinking about a series or something. So knowing when it's finished is, I guess it's when I finish that last mark, and if I put a frame around it, then I know it's done. So that's a tough question. I hope that helps. How do you select work for exhibitions? A lot of times the exhibitions I will look for online, in publications, through friends, and through organizations that I belong to. And then I'll make sure that the work that I have, that I'm producing, fits with the category, fits with the topic that that exhibition's about. I'll also take a look at who the jurors are, or who's bringing artwork into it, just to make sure that the work that I create fits what they tend to gravitate towards. Um, Sometimes I also look at the price that it would cost for me to submit work. Sometimes exhibition it doesn't cost anything to submit work, but sometimes it gets kind of expensive. So those are some of the things that I consider. But making sure that my work fits the category is probably the most important part of it. Who are the artists and thinkers who influence you? Well, I'm influenced by about 36,000 years worth of art history. So going all the way back to the textures that were made on cave walls, through all of the art history. And I guess when it comes down to it, I really am influenced by, well, 50s and 60s to today. I've always been a fan of people who use a lot of lines and shapes and colors, Matisse and Keith Haring and Jasper Johns with textures, and Robert Rauschenberg with assemblages. Um, there's a vast amount of artists that I really like. Helen Frankenthaler with her color field paintings, Anne Truitt with her sculptural work and very flat colors. Um, the list goes on and on. And I think one of the most important things, and you ask this later on, advice I give to an art student, I think that looking at all of art history, what's happened in the past and all the way up to contemporary art, and being engaged in that world, as somebody who works with students, I see a lot of times there's a frustration in not wanting to look at and research artists. So I'm fortunate that I love art history. Being an art nerd like that, I love reading and listening to. If you get a chance, let's see, the Modern Art Notes podcast is a great one to listen to. If you want contemporary, current artists, local people, Authentic Obsessions is another podcast. A great British show that I've liked is called A Brush With. So staying in tune with what's happening in the contemporary art world, art history, those are all really good. I think those are great bits of advice. So thank you for asking that one. What are you looking at or thinking about these days for art ideas? As I said earlier, I'm really looking at what's happening in contemporary society and how that affects me and how that affects the people that are around me. And so those are places I look to for my own ideas. I look out to nature for colors. I look to other symbols for color references. Um, and so I really focus in on what's happening out there. But sometimes my art's not about that. Sometimes my art is about what happens within the piece, what happens just inside that small or large composition, and how the ideas relate to one another and those relationships that are built inside of there. So yeah, I always looking, watching the news, checking out movies, reading books, listening to people, seeing what's happening out in the world. What mistakes have I made and what have I learned from them? Holy cow. I make mistakes all the time in the artworks that I do. And I think more so than like huge life changing mistakes, which fortunately I don't have too many of those. I don't have any. I'm perfect. Um, I I know that they can all be fixed. So whatever I make a mistake on in an artwork, I can always go back and fix it. Nothing is ever beyond a point where I have to put a piece aside and get rid of it and forget about it. I can always put it away, maybe come back to it later and fix it. Um, but working with acrylic, it's very forgiving. So I can just work over the top of it once it's dry, or scrape it away if it's an oil painting, or if it's a sculpture, I can recreate a piece. Or if there's a mistake that's working, I can incorporate that error into the artwork. I like the idea of having the ideas, the process in the piece. So if I can see some of those underlying lines, maybe that's very good for the work. Maybe that's successful in the composition. So yeah, I think the most important thing when it comes to artworks is working on one piece, always thinking about the next. I like to work on a number of pieces, but working on those works, and then thinking back and reflecting on what went well and what you struggled with, and then carrying that over to the next piece and putting that into use there, and then carrying that to the next piece. And so just always trying to remember what worked and maybe what didn't work. How and why, or why and how did you start making art? I think back to being just a little kid and knowing that my parents were entertained, my grandparents were entertained by my little drawings. My classmates in kindergarten were entertained by the artwork that I was able to make. Um, and it was just something that I was very interested in. I wasn't, and I said this before, I wasn't very good as a high school artist, but I got much better as I continued to put time and energy into it. The more I practiced, the better I got. And I'm still learning things. And so I guess it was one of those parts of my life where I was fortunate to have an interest in it. I kind of was okay at it, but got better. But I also had a lot of support from the people that were around me to just keep working on it. And today I think that's probably my biggest thanks is I have family and friends who support me. My biggest supporters, my wife and my daughter, they may not always understand what I'm doing, but they know that uh, that it's important to me, and so I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that last question, and I think I answered it earlier, but what advice would you give to an art student? If I made one mistake in life, it would have been in college where I didn't spend enough time in the studios pushing myself to make art, going to lectures to learn about artists, spending more time looking through books. We didn't have the internet like you do now, but I didn't spend that kind of time as a young artist doing that. Fortunately, I had great teachers and professors and friends who pushed me to that. So look all of the time, draw all of the time. constantly be writing down your ideas, constantly be sketching things out and drawing from observation, drawing from your imagination, trying to find your direction in your art. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, please email me back, fjkorb@gmail.com. Check out my website, frankkorb.com. As my students told me today, and I'm going to get it wrong, like it, subscribe, and share. Otherwise, thanks for asking the question. If you have any other questions, please give me a holler. Take care. Bye-bye.